There are powers walking in the wild places of this world that have no name. Not servants of Sauron, not servants of the Valar, not the wizards who came from the west with their staffs and their purposes and their careful, deliberate plans. Something else. Something older. Something that chose, long ago, to step off the great stage of the world's wars and simply disappear. And I am telling you now, as a man who has spent 40 years walking the roads that most men avoid, the forgotten paths between kingdoms, the high passes that traders gave up on centuries ago, the marshes where nothing living chooses to go, I am telling you that they are out there. I have seen them. I have spoken with one. And what it told me changed everything I thought I understood about the history of this world. My name is Aldric. I have been a ranger of the North for 4 decades. And before you dismiss me as another wanderer with too many nights alone and too much imagination, understand this. I am not the first ranger to encounter such things. I am simply the first one willing to talk about it. We were taught, growing up, that the Maiar were accounted for, that the great powers below the Valar had all declared themselves. Sauron, who turned to Morgoth and became darkness, the Balrogs, who fell with their master and burned, the wizards, who came to Middle-earth in the Third Age, wrapped in old bodies to counsel and guide, Orsa, who serves Ulmo and shapes the waves, Melian, who walked in the forests of Beleriand and wed a king and clothed a realm in enchantment. We were taught that all of them had a role, a side, a story we could point to and say, there, and that is what they chose, that is what they became. But no one ever counted them. No one sat down with a list and said, here are all the Maiar who ever existed. Here is what each one chose. Here is where each one ended up. Because no such list exists. The Valar brought many spirits into the world at its making. Many. And the wars of the First Age swallowed the records. Morgoth burned the great trees. Beleriand was destroyed. So much knowledge was lost. And in that loss, in those gaps, there is room. Room for things that chose something no one expected. Room for the ones who chose nothing at all. I became a ranger young. 17 years old, given a grey cloak and a sword, and told that the North needed watching. The Dunedain of the North are few, have been few since the fall of Arnor, or since the wars with Angmar that broke our kingdom and scattered our people. But the work does not diminish just because the workers do. The roads still need walking. The dark places still need watching. The rumors that drift in from the wild places still need someone willing to go out and find out whether they are true. In 40 years I have covered ground that most men would not believe existed. The deep forests of Rudar where the old stone roads still run, cracked and overgrown, going nowhere anyone lives anymore. The marshes of the Midgewater, where you can walk for 3 days without seeing anything except rushes and sky and the distant shapes of birds that are not quite birds. The hills above Fornost, where the ruins of the old capital lie under a weight of silence so profound it feels like something pressing down on you, and something that has been sitting on that hilltop for 600 years and does not intend to move. I have seen wights rise from their barrows in the Barrow Downs on nights when the mist sits low. I have tracked trolls through the weather hills in winter when they are bold and hungry and careless. I have found camps of orcs in places orcs should not be and dealt with them, and moved on before anyone knew I was there. I have sat at the edge of the old forest on moonless nights and listened to the trees argue in a language that has no words. None of that prepared me for what I found in the valley above the source of the Bruinen. It was the summer of my 31st year of service. I was ranging east of the Weather Hills, following a report of unusual fires seen by shepherds in the high country. Not orc fires. The shepherds were specific about that. Orc fires smell of fat and garbage, and sometimes worse. These fires, they said, smelled of nothing, burned blue-white in the distance, and cast no shadows. 3 shepherds had seen them on 3 separate nights. 3 sensible men who had worked those hills for decades, and had no reason to lie, and no imagination sufficient to invent something they had no frame of reference for. I found the valley on the 4th day. It was not on any map I carried. A fold in the hills, perfectly placed to be invisible from any of the surrounding high ground, the kind of natural concealment that makes you wonder if it was shaped that way deliberately. A stream ran through the bottom of it. Clean water, clear as glass, cold even in summer. Grass that was somehow green and thick even in the dry heat that had been baking the hills for a month. And trees. Old trees. Not the calculated ancientness of the old forest, not that sense of something brooding and aware. These trees felt different, quiet. Not asleep, exactly. More like something that has been sitting very still for a very long time by choice. I almost missed him entirely. He was sitting with his back against one of the older trees, perfectly still, his eyes open and looking at nothing in particular. He looked like a man. Old, but not ancient. The kind of old that comes from a long outdoor life rather than years alone. Grey hair worn loose. Simple clothes, undyed wool. No insignia, no mark of any house or faction or purpose. He was holding a stone in his hand. Just a river stone. Smooth and dark. Turning it over and over very slowly with his fingers. He said, without looking at me, without giving any sign that he had heard my approach through 50 yards of undergrowth, "Your hand is on your sword, which means you are afraid, and your cloak is grey, which means you are Dunedain, and neither of those things is necessary here. I have dealt with many strange things in the wilderness." My hand stayed on my sword. I told him I always approached strangers cautiously in wild country. He said that was sensible, and then he looked at me for the first time, and I understood immediately that whatever this was, it was not a man. It is not that his eyes were the wrong color, or glowed or burned the way the stories describe. Nothing so dramatic. It was the quality of the attention behind them. When a man looks at you, even a very intelligent man, even a very old man who has seen a great deal, there is a limit to what you feel in that gaze. A human horizon. This was different. Looking into this being's eyes was like looking down a road that went on much further than roads are supposed to go. An awareness that extended beyond what any face should contain. Old. Not just in years, in kind. I asked him what he was. He considered the question for a moment, as if it were genuinely interesting to him, and said he was not sure how to answer that in terms I would find useful. I asked him how long he had been in the valley. He tilted his head slightly and said, "What year is it?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "A very long time, then." I sat down. I do not know why. Some instinct told me that whatever danger existed in this valley, it was not the kind that a sword would address, and some other instinct, the same one that keeps rangers alive through decades of work in dark places, told me that this was important. That walking away from this valley without understanding what was sitting in it would be a mistake I would not get another chance to correct. We talked for a long time. He was not forthcoming exactly, but he was not evasive either. He answered what I asked with a precision that felt almost careful, as if he was choosing exactly how much truth to deliver and in what form. And slowly, Across the span of that afternoon, I began to understand what I was looking at. He had come into the world at its making, one of many spirits drawn into creation when Ilúvatar sang the world into being, and the Valar descended to shape it. He had been, in the beginning, a spirit of growing things, not of Yavanna herself, not as powerful as the Valar, but of her order. One of many, one of the countless lesser powers who spent the first ages of the world tending the gardens and forests of Aman, learning the nature of living things, existing in a kind of purposeful service that he described, carefully, as satisfying. And then Morgoth had ruined everything. I asked him if he had fought, in the wars of the First Age, in the long struggle against Morgoth that consumed Beleriand and ended with the world broken. He was quiet for a long time before answering. He said, "I was asked too." I waited. He turned the river stone over in his fingers, set it down, picked it up again. He said that Yavanna had called for those of her order who were willing to take form and enter the world and work against Morgoth's corruption of living things. Morgoth had warped forests, had turned growing things into instruments of fear and pain, had corrupted the green places of the world the way he had corrupted everything else he touched, and Yavanna wanted her people in Middle-earth to push back, to heal what could be healed, to resist the darkness where resistance was possible. He said, "I was willing at first." He came into the world, took form, not the form of a man at first, something older, something that fit better with the forests and the living things he had come to tend. He would not tell me what that form was, and I did not press him. He spent years in the forests of Beleriand, working quietly, or healing what Morgoth's servants had corrupted, keeping certain groves and valleys green even as the war burned everything around them. He was not a warrior, had no desire to be one. He worked at the edges of things, in the margins of the great conflict, doing what he could in the spaces the armies had not yet reached. And then came the moment when quiet work at the edges was no longer possible. He described what happened in the way that someone describes a wound that never fully healed. Not with dramatic language, with a flatness that somehow made it worse. Dagor Bragolach, he said, the Battle of Sudden Flame. The year Morgoth broke the siege of Angband with rivers of fire and undid in a single assault what the elves had spent 4 centuries building. The green fields of Ardgarlan burned in a single day. The forests of Dorthonion, where he had spent decades working, tending, protecting, burned. The elves who had held the northern passes were scattered or destroyed. Everything that had existed in the north of Beleriand was simply gone. And in that moment, he said, Yavanna called again. Not for healers, not for those who tend and grow, for those willing to fight, to enter the war directly, to take the power they had been given and use it as a weapon against the darkness that was consuming everything. He did not answer. I asked him why. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Then he said, I had seen what happens to those who enter the war directly. I had seen the Balrogs. I had seen what Morgoth does to those of my kind who fall into his hands. Not death. Something worse. He takes what they are and inverts it, keeps all the power and removes everything that made the power good. And I was afraid. Not of death. Of becoming what they became. Of looking, one day, at the thing I had turned into, and recognizing nothing of what I had been. So he withdrew, went deeper into the wild places that the war had not yet reached, found valleys that fire had not touched, and he stayed there, and the war went on without him. I sat with that for a moment. I am a ranger. My entire life has been built on the premise that the darkness needs to be fought, that you take up the watch because, if you do not, someone else pays the price for your absence. I have friends who died on that watch. I have walked into danger I was not certain I would walk out of, because the alternative was walking away. So I understood, intellectually, the choice he had made, and I found it very hard to understand it in any other way. I asked him if he regretted it. He picked up the river stone and looked at it for a long time. He said, every day. Then he said, and also no, because I am still myself. I am still what I was made to be, and I have watched what the war did to those who entered it on the right side with pure intentions and great power and genuine love of the good. I have watched what it cost them, not just the ones who fell to Morgoth, the ones who survived, what it takes to use power as a weapon when your nature is not a weapon, what it takes to destroy when your purpose was creation. I watched from the edges. I saw the cost, and I do not know, truly, if the version of me that entered that war would have survived it with anything worth preserving. I asked him what he had seen from the edges, what the view was like from outside the war, and this is where he became something I hadn't expected. Not reluctant, generous, as if this was something he had been waiting a long time to tell someone, as if the choice to step back from the war had included, as its hidden cost, the impossibility of ever speaking honestly about what he had witnessed. And now, for reasons I still do not fully understand, he had decided to speak. He said, I want you to understand something that the histories do not capture, something that is lost in the telling of wars as sequences of battles and victories and defeats. Morgoth was not winning simply because he was powerful. He was winning because his servants believed in something, really believed. The Balrogs had given themselves to him completely. Sauron had given himself to him completely. And those who give themselves completely to a single purpose, even a terrible one, are extraordinarily difficult to stop, because they do not hesitate. They do not wonder if they are right. They simply move forward with absolute conviction. I asked him if that made the elves' resistance hopeless. He said no, it made it heroic. There is a difference. Hopeless means defeat was certain. Heroic means it was not certain, but it required everything they had and more. And what they had, ultimately, was enough. Barely. With great cost. With losses that are still being mourned in the songs of those who remember. Then he said something that has stayed with me longer than anything else from that afternoon. He said, the problem with Morgoth was not that he was evil. Evil can be fought. Evil is comprehensible. What the problem was that he was right about one thing. The world is impermanent. The things we love will end. The works we build will crumble. He was right about that. He was only wrong about what it meant. He thought it meant nothing mattered. The elves understood that it meant everything mattered more. I asked him then the question I had been building toward since I sat down. I asked if he was alone. He looked at me for a long time with that road that goes too far gaze. Then he said, no. I asked him how many. He said he did not know exactly, that the ones who chose as he chose did not, as a rule, seek each other out. The whole point of the choice was to disappear, to stop being part of the great account of things. Meeting each other would defeat the purpose. But, he said, I know of others. I have encountered them, rarely, was in the deep places I have moved through. And I know what they are because I recognize the quality I see in them, the same old awareness. the same careful stillness, the same distance from the world of events. I asked him what kinds, what orders, what purposes. He considered for a long time, and then he told me. There are spirits of water, he said, who serve neither Ulmo's purposes nor Morgoth's corruptions. Osa, who is known, who nearly fell and was recalled, was not the only one of Ulmo's people to be tempted and to struggle. Others were tempted. Some fell entirely. But some stood at the edge of that fall and stepped back, and in stepping back, stepped sideways out of the whole account. They are in the deep rivers now, in the lakes that have no outlet, in the springs that rise from far beneath the earth and carry a cold so clean it hurts to drink. They are not hostile. They are not friendly. They are simply there, and they have been there for very long, and they will be there long after everything else that currently seems important has been forgotten. He paused, and then he said, "You have probably encountered one. Without knowing what you were encountering, I thought about that." I told him about a lake I had camped beside once, 3 days east of Weathertop, on a long ranging in my early years of service. A lake with no name on any map I carried. Still water. No wind reached it, even on days when the surrounding country was battered by autumn storms. I had drunk from it, and the water had tasted like something I could not name. Not mineral, not cold exactly. More like the memory of cold, like something that had once been ice, so ancient it carried the flavor of an earlier age of the world. I had slept beside it one night and dreamed nothing. Not dreamlessly, which is a kind of rest. Just nothing. A blank space where the night should have been, as if something had simply lifted that portion of my consciousness out of the normal run of things for 8 hours and set it gently back in the morning. He nodded slowly when I described it. He said, "It was looking at you, deciding whether you were a threat. You were not. So it let you sleep." I was quiet for a moment, recalibrating every strange lake and unmarked spring I had ever camped beside. "There are spirits of stone and deep places," he continued, "of the craft of Orle, but not his devotion. Shihorlu shaped the mountains and the deep places of the earth, and poured his knowledge into his servants and his students. And some of those servants learned the knowledge, and loved the stone and the craft, and had no interest whatsoever in the purposes that drove the great conflicts above them. They went down, into the foundations of the world, into places deeper than the dwarves have ever delved, and they tend something there. He was not specific about what, only that it requires tending, only that without it something would become unstable." "What kind of unstable?" I asked. He looked at me for a moment and then said, "The kind where the word unstable is insufficient," and he did not elaborate. He said this without drama, as a simple statement of fact, which somehow made it more unsettling than any dramatic claim could have. "There are reasons," and he said, "why certain mountains do not fall. Why certain fault lines in the deep earth hold instead of releasing. Why the world's foundations have borne the weight of every war and cataclysm visited upon them without the whole structure coming apart. You have attributed this to the craft of the Valar. Some of it is. Not all of it." I had no answer for that. So I said nothing, and he moved on. "And there are spirits of the air," he said, speaking with something that might have been reluctant admiration. "Some of the Maiar of wind and sky, and the high places who were not Eönwe, not the great herald, but lesser ones, who grew weary of the wars and the politics of the upper air, and simply went into the world and became part of it. They are in the high places now, the mountain peaks where the air is so thin no one goes. the great windstorms that move across empty ocean, the places where weather happens before anyone sees it. I thought about the storm I had sheltered from 2 winters ago in a narrow pass above Rivendell. 3 days of wind so coherent it had seemed almost deliberate, moving in a single sustained direction with a consistency no natural storm maintained. It had not touched me where I sheltered. I had told myself the geography of the pass explained it, that the walls of the ravine had simply directed the worst of it overhead. I had believed that at the time. They are not malicious, he said. They are not benevolent in any directed way. They are simply enormous and very old, and they have given up on caring about the small conflicts of the lower world. But they remember what clean air was before Morgoth's fires, and they tend that, in their way, in the high places where the air is still what it was made to be. You breathe better in the mountains than in the lowlands. You always have. You have assumed this was simply altitude and wind. It is also something else. I asked him if any of them could be reached, spoken to, called on. He said, "What would you want from them?" I said I did not know. Knowledge, maybe. Help with the darkness that was still in the world. He shook his head slowly. Not in refusal exactly. More in the way of someone who has thought through a problem very carefully and arrived at a conclusion they do not enjoy. He said, "We chose to stop. That choice is not reversible for most of us. It has been too long. We have grown too deep into the shape of the world. What I am now is not what I was when I entered the war's edges. I am more stone than spirit, more root than will. The power I have now is not of the kind that wins battles. It is the power of something that has existed so long in one place that the place and the thing have become the same. And that is not a weapon. It cannot be aimed. It cannot be directed. It simply is, and it will continue to be, long after whatever you are afraid of has either triumphed or failed." I asked him if that bothered him. Being that. Being something that had given up the ability to change anything. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "There was a war. In the First Age, the greatest war this world has seen. Good fought evil for centuries, and in the end, good won. Barely. At terrible cost. And then there was another war. Slower. Centuries long. The long shadow of Sauron, rising and falling and rising again. And good struggled against that too. And will again. Perhaps. Or perhaps not. I do not know the ending. I stopped watching. I asked him why. He picked up the Riverstone one more time and held it very still. He said, "Because watching things end is unbearable when you were there at the beginning, when you remember what the world was before it was broken, before Morgoth marred it, before the trees were killed and the light was stolen. I remember what it was. I cannot help you with what it is. All I can do is tend the small piece of it I am responsible for. Keep this valley green. Keep this stream clean. Keep the memory of what good growing things were supposed to be alive in this one small corner of the world. It is not nothing. But I understand if it seems like very little. It did not seem like very little to me. It seemed like grief, the oldest possible grief. The grief of something that remembers paradise and has spent millennia watching it erode. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. You have been listening to the account of a man who sat in a hidden valley and spoke with something older than the wars of this world. If you want to hear more stories from the edges, more voices from those who found things in the forgotten places, then stay and listen. Subscribe to Whispers from the Shire. because there are more of these encounters than anyone records, and they deserve to be told. Thank you. I spent 3 days in that valley. The being, whatever he truly was, didn't invite me to stay and didn't ask me to leave. He simply continued to exist in his careful, ancient way, and I set up my camp by the stream and watched him and thought and tried to understand what I had found and what it meant. On the morning of the second day, I woke before dawn and lay still in my bedroll and watched him work. He was moving through the valley with an attention I had seen in no living person. Not the attention of someone performing a task, the attention of someone in conversation. He would stop beside a plant and crouch and place one hand flat against the earth near its roots for a long time. Sometimes he would move on immediately. Sometimes he would stay for several minutes, motionless, head slightly bowed, and then rise and move to the next and the next. He was not tending the valley the way a gardener tends a garden. He was listening to it. And occasionally, from the slight adjustments of his posture, or from the small tilts of his head, I had the impression it was answering. The stream changed while I watched, not dramatically, not in any way I could point to and say, "There, that is the moment it changed." But there was a quality to the light on the water at dawn, a particular fractured silver, and at some point, between watching him move and watching the stream, I noticed that the light had deepened, become more concentrated, as if the water were more itself than it had been an hour ago, more fully what water was supposed to be. I asked him later, in the morning, what he had been doing. He said, "The valley has been under pressure. There are things moving in the hill country to the east. Not immediately dangerous to this place, but their presence creates a kind of tension in the ground. The living things feel it before any creature with awareness does. They tighten, pull inward, and if you let that go unaddressed for too long, the valley loses something, a quality of openness, of willingness to grow. You have to remind it that the pressure is not here yet, that it is safe to continue being what it is." I asked him if he was speaking about plants. He considered this carefully and then said, "I am speaking about what plants participate in, the living network of root and water and soil that connects everything growing in this valley into something that is not quite a single organism, but is also not simply a collection of separate ones. It is aware, after a fashion, not as you or I are aware, but it knows something is wrong at the edges of its world, and it is my responsibility to know when that knowledge is becoming fear, and to address the fear before it becomes something the valley cannot recover from." I lay there for a moment, processing that. Then I asked him how long the valley would survive without him. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "It would not die immediately. The roots go deep. The water is old. But within a few centuries it would begin to change. The quality would shift. It would become simply a valley. Green perhaps, still functional, still a place where things grew. But the particular quality it has now, the thing that makes the water taste as it does, and the light fall as it does, and the silence sound as it does, that would fade. That is the work. Not preventing death. Preserving a particular quality of life against the slow erosion of a world that has been marred. I thought about all the valleys and forests and riversides I had passed through in 40 years of ranging. Wondered how many of them had once had that quality. Wondered what had been lost in the long centuries of wars and darkness before I was born. On the second day I asked him about Sauron. There was a change in the quality of his stillness when I said the name. Not fear, something more complicated. He was quiet for a while, and then he said, "Sauron is what I feared becoming, and also not, because Sauron chose his path with full intention, and I do not think he regrets it even now. He made himself into something that believes completely in order, in the domination of the will, in the idea that chaos and freedom are the same thing, and that both of them are the root of all suffering. He is not wrong exactly, or he is simply wrong about the solution." I asked him what the solution was. He said, "I genuinely do not know. If I knew, I might have been willing to fight for it." The ones who fought on both sides of every war had certainty. The Valar believed in their vision of what the world should be. Morgoth believed in his. Sauron believes in his now. The elves who stood against them all believed in something they could not always name, but could feel, clearly, as the thing worth dying for. I never had that certainty. I had only the knowledge of what things were before they were broken, and that is not a vision. It is a memory, and you cannot fight for a memory. On the third day, I asked the question that had been forming since the first moment of that first afternoon. I asked what his existence meant for the world that was currently living in it. He looked at me with what I can only describe as careful attention. He said, "I think you are asking whether we are useful, whether knowing we exist changes anything for you and the people you protect." I said that was exactly what I was asking. He said, "Honestly, perhaps not in any direct way. We cannot be called on. We will not march. We will not lend our power to any cause, however righteous, because the moment we begin lending power to causes, we have chosen sides again. And chosen sides means chosen enemies, and chosen enemies means entering the war we chose to leave. That path does not end. Once started, it simply continues until either victory or destruction. I have no interest in either destination. But," he said, and he paused here, turning the stone one final time, "but our existence means something that I think matters more than any direct assistance we could offer. It means the world is larger than its wars. It means there are powers in this world that Sauron does not command and doesn't understand and cannot find and cannot corrupt, because we were not findable or corruptible even in the age of Morgoth himself. It means the darkness has not won everything, that there are places, small places, hidden places, where the world is still what it was supposed to be, where the water is clean and the growing things are tended, and the memory of what was good is still alive. That is not nothing," he said. "In the age of Sauron, in the long, grinding shadow of his power over the minds and wills of men, knowing that there are things he cannot reach is not nothing." I left the valley on the morning of the fourth day. He was sitting against his tree as I packed my camp. He did not say goodbye. He did not acknowledge my departure in any obvious way. But as I was climbing the slope back toward the outside world, I heard him speak one more time, his voice carried with a clarity that should not have been possible over that distance. He said, "Ranger, the blue wizards who went east and did not return to the councils of the west, the ones your histories barely mention, the ones whose names even Gandalf cannot quite recall, they were not lost." I stopped walking. He said, "They chose, as I chose. They went deep into the east and they found something worth tending, and they stayed with it. And the peoples of the east who did not fall entirely to Sauron's dominion, who held something of themselves back, even under his shadow, they did so because there were things working quietly at the edges of their world that you in the west have never heard of and never will. The war against Morgoth, the war against Sauron. These are the stories you know. They are real and great and important. But they are not the only stories. The world is being tended in more places than you can see from where you stand." And then he was quiet, and I climbed out of the valley and walked back into the ordinary world with its ordinary light and its ordinary roads and its ordinary dangers, and I never found the valley again, though I looked twice in subsequent years. The fold in the hills was there. The surrounding country was exactly as I remembered. But the valley itself, the stream, the old trees, the green grass, the stillness, but it was gone. Or rather, I think it had never truly been findable by anyone who was not supposed to find it. And whatever reason I had been supposed to find it, I had found it. And now I was not supposed to again. I have thought about that afternoon for years, turned it over and over the way he turned that river stone. What I keep coming back to is this. We tell the history of the great wars as the history of powers, of Morgoth's corruption and the Valar's response, of Sauron's rise and the resistance of the free peoples, and those histories are true, but they are the surface of something. Underneath the wars, underneath the great choosing of sides and the great battles and the great losses, there was something else happening. In the hidden valleys, in the deep rivers, in the roots of mountains and the currents of high wind. There were powers that the wars could not quite reach, powers that chose to tend rather than fight, to remember rather than act, to keep small pieces of the world whole when everything around them was breaking. They did not win any battle. They did not turn the tide at any crucial moment. They are not remembered in any song I have heard. But they were there, and they are there still, in the hidden places, doing what they were made to do, in a world they were given and never entirely surrendered. And somewhere in the east, if he was right, 2 old men with no particular desire to be remembered are tending something that the shadow of Sauron never quite covered, keeping some part of that vast, forgotten country green. Sauron was not the last of his kind. He was not even the most typical of his kind. Most of the Maiar did not choose power, did not choose darkness, and did not choose the grand resistance to darkness either. Most of them chose something quieter, something smaller, something that will outlast every war this world has ever seen or will see. Because the world is still being tended by things that were here at its beginning and will be here at whatever is coming next. And that, stranger, is either a comfort or a warning, depending on what you think is coming. I choose to find it a comfort. My name is Aldric. I have been a ranger of the North for 4 decades, and I am telling you this so you understand. The world is larger than its wars, always has been, and somewhere in a valley you cannot find, something ancient is turning a river stone over in its fingers and keeping the water clean, and that is not nothing. That is everything.